Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the Bellingham City Council Committee meetings of November 9th, 2015. We have several committees this afternoon. The first committee we have is Parks and Rec, and it's chaired by Roxanne Murphy.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. I'm happy to convene the Parks and Recreation Committee, and I am joined by fellow council members Borneman and Weiss on this council. And we have one agenda item, and it is a proposed ordinance for a smoking ban in city parks. And this will be presented by Councilmember Weiss.
Thanks, Roxanne. I wanted to just basically start out. This is a proposal I've been thinking about wanting to propose to the council for all year, and we've had the opportunity to discuss it at a council retreat in June, and I've brought forward some language that I'd like to have considered for today. The ordinance would expand on the city's existing smoking ban, which on a couple different fronts. The current ban right now is just for indoor smoking on city buildings. It does provide provision for the mayor to provide for exception areas to that ban on a case-by-case basis. This ordinance would expand that indoor smoking ban to the entire city property associated with those buildings, or in the case of parks, the park property itself, which would also include the greenways trails and also any sort of open space that the park system has. On top of that, the ban would further extend to electronic devices such as vaping, in the acknowledgement that secondhand smoke coming from, or vapors coming from those types of activities have been proven to be hazardous to people as secondhand vapors. I think it's fairly clear what the health impacts are of secondhand smoke, and that's been something that has been well documented over the last few decades. And I wanted to, I have some handouts that are in front of you, and I wanted to just briefly go through these. The first one has to do with, people have been saying, well, this is somewhat unusual and unique, has this been tried before? What's the enforcement issues? And what I wanted to do is to provide both a map of where smoking policies already exist in other jurisdictions, and then a more detailed table showing the cities involved with these bans and what year that they were enacted. And I think you can tell that it's a relatively new phenomenon since I think the true hazards of cigarette smoking were known back in the 50s and 60s. That it's taken this long for cities to actually say, maybe this isn't the best thing to go and have in our park system and to have recreational users be subjected to secondhand smoke associated with tobacco. So that gives you a pretty broad spectrum of cities, both in rural cities and urban cities and everything in between, small, large. It really kind of covers the gamut on that. The other thing that I have been hearing as concerns about this particular ban proposal has to do with, is the city over-regulating? And it's a fair question. But I guess the response that I would have is on the following sheet, which has what our current regulations and prohibitions are in our city park system. And we have quite a few, actually, and I'll just go and read them off real quick for people that don't have this sheet. But, these are things that the city currently prohibits in parks. And as I read these off, I'd like everybody to think about, does this really impact health and safety of people that are in the parks themselves, just recreating in the parks. So littering, cars that are off the pavement or on trails, and believe it or not, 15, 20 years ago, cars on trails were actually a big deal, and we didn't have our bollards up yet, and people were actually driving on trails. Camping is not allowed. Campfires are not allowed. You're not allowed to go and sell things in the park. You're not allowed to rent things without permission. Can't post your own individual signs in parks. Alcohol, of course, is not allowed unless it's permitted by the park director. Marijuana is not allowed. Public sex is not allowed. I mean, that's kind of a social constraint. Internal combustion boat engines on Lake Padden. Bicycles at the Seaholm Arboretum, there's bans against those. After-hour public access, parks close at night, and so the parks aren't available 24 hours a day. And then comes dogs, dogs off leash. We do have certain areas that are okay, and they're posted, but for the most reasons that dogs are not allowed off leash in most of our parks, and the failure to pick up after dogs that's pretty much all over the place in our parks and trails. And oddly enough, if you place leaves in our trash cans, that's specifically listed in our municipal code as not being allowed. So I lay that out in direct. I don't know what I want to say, but and I want to be able to show that this comment about overregulation is, in my mind, not worthy of consideration. Primarily because the things that the smoking ban has to do with is the health impacts of secondhand smoke. We talk about children at the retreat. We also need to think about, seniors, adults that have health impacts, respiratory health impacts, or could have respiratory health impacts if they get exposed to this. People that have asthma, and I think the overall aspect of it is that, unlike many of these other issues that I just listed off, the idea of it really impacting on somebody else. We have these other prohibitions. They don't necessarily impact on people, but they impact on our staff through the fact that we have to pick up litter or some other conflicts that might occur. It's not necessarily the case with smoking. When you smoke, you are impacting on other people if they can smell it. And finally, I just want to go and again talk about litter. There is one section of our municipal code that talks about litter, meaning garbage, refuse, rubbish, or any other waste material which, if thrown or deposited as prohibited in this section, tends, and this is the most important point, litter creates a nuisance which annoys, injures, or endangers health, safety, or comfort of the public. So the words that really stick out for me is that annoys or harms the comfort of the public. You talk about litter, and then you talk about secondhand smoke actually harming people. That's the reason why I want to propose this and move forward with it. I do have, moving on to another impact of cigarettes is, of course, the litter associated with it. I've presented two photographs that I've taken. One is that has all the numbers on it, or the number of cigarette butts that were placed adjacent. So there's a parking lot that was built over by Sunset Pond a few months ago. There's a sidewalk which is about maybe 6 feet wide, and then there's a lawn. And right next to, adjacent to the sidewalk, nearby the cars, in this 1 5-foot section that was built 3 weeks earlier, there were already, in this section, about 11 cigarette butts. It's just like, this is how prevalent it is for littering. The other photograph I took on Friday, And this is in Birchwood Park. I did not stage this, even though it looks like it should be staged. But there is a cigarette carton with what I can see is maybe a half a dozen cigarette butts right next to a trash can, right next to a playground. And this is what we're having to deal with, what our staff has to deal with whenever they're dealing with having to maintain our parks in a good, good and healthy way, and present our parks in the best way possible. There will be, even though today they're not here for this afternoon because it's a committee meeting, but tonight at public comment, we'll be hearing public comments from the county's health officer, Greg Stern, from somebody from the Public Health Advisory Board, which is a county agency, from a couple students from, I believe it's Squalicum High School, which ended up doing a butt pickup program a couple years ago and presented their report to the Parks Board in 2013. And then there is a letter attached to the handouts I gave you today from Peace Health Hospital. The Parks Department has commented on it. The Greenways Advisory Committee is also will be commenting on it. And of course, there are a number of citizens that have views both ways associated with this. So what I wanted to do is to ask, even though I didn't talk to Leslie about it, but I'd like to ask Leslie if she had any questions or comments about this particular proposal as it pertains to parks, since it will impact parks mostly.
Thank you. For the record, Leslie Bryson, Interim Director of Parks and Recreation. This is something that has come to our department in the past. It was a Shuckson Middle School group who had the Kick Butts campaign. They went out to some of our park sites and picked up cigarette butts, and it was amazing how many there were. And the health department brought forward a proposal at that time, just looking at playgrounds where children congregate mostly, and that did not move forward at that time. So it is something that we have looked at and considered in the past. I also want to point out that there are some facilities in our park system. Civic, it does not allow smoking, and that was per an agreement we made with the school district years ago, because we have a lot of school events at Civic. Within the stadium and spectator areas, there is no smoking at Civic. And I believe under state law, there is, when we were researching this earlier with the health department, by state law, there is currently no smoking in areas where people congregate and sit in public facilities, which could be considered a picnic shelter or benches or other spectator seating kinds of areas. So we already have that in place for some areas. But I think it was, I had heard or read somewhere that people thought this already pertained to playgrounds, and I don't believe it does. So I just wanted to comment on the areas where I think we already have no smoking. This was discussed at Park Board. One of their biggest concerns was about enforcement. It was a 5-2-1 vote, as you saw in the memo that was presented to you. And as far as implementing it, the language in the ordinance about signage and clearly marking where the no smoking begins and ends could be somewhat problematic. We can add signs to our trail bollards. We can amend our current signs to add that. So, but implementing that, I think we should have a little clarity on how that would work.
Thanks, Leslie. You know, the whole concept of the enforcement issue, it is pretty much along the same lines as how we enforce a number of other things, both in the parks and just citywide, when it comes to, a social, and I would like to have the police chief speak to this, and I think he's preparing to.
I need to create a moment of clarity here. We have 5 minutes left for this committee, supposedly, so let's try to make it quick so we can get to the council member questions and feedback.
Well, thank you, Cliff Cook, Chief of Police. And my comments are not intended to bear on the issue of whether this is an appropriate health decision or quality of life or quality of experience in parks or other public areas. And my comments are strictly based on enforcement. This would be a very low priority issue for my department. We don't have the personnel to do the kind of patrolling on trails or in parks to enforce it. And quite frankly, an enforcement action, like many of our other prohibitions currently, our attitude is warn before we cite. And if someone's warned and takes appropriate action and quits or ceases the activity, then we don't take any enforcement activity or action at all. The other concern I have is I've had this experience in another jurisdiction where I was chief of police, where the intent was much the same, but we ran into some issues around parks, especially where there was public sidewalks or public ways for people to move. And I don't know yet whether those have been challenged at a higher level in the courts, but I'm concerned about what position that places my personnel in when they're trying to enforce a complaint of smoking in the park when the actual activity is occurring adjacent to it on a sidewalk and the impact is being felt in the park. And last but not least, it was mentioned that there are a number of ordinances that prohibit activity on the city's BMC, and I agree with that, many of which we don't enforce actively, some of which we do enforce, and the reality is the enforcement has minimal to no impact. Two of those that I could bring to your attention would be drinking in public, which is prohibited, quite frequently occurs in our city center, urinating in public, defecating in public. There's a number of activities associated around individuals that we do take active enforcement on. They are infractions. We can't make an arrest, and there is no follow-up to someone who receives multiple citations for the same activity or violation and chooses to ignore those by not appearing in court. So I think in spite of what the intent may be, the impact on my agency is going to be, it's going to be another ordinance that even if we're actively enforcing it, is not going to be carried out where it has any real meaning to the individuals that we're dealing with on a regular basis. The average citizen will cease that kind of activity when asked or when we ask. Others will choose to ignore it.
Thank you. Can I continue? Thank you. Okay, so the issue behind all of this was really to allow for peer-to-peer social enforcement, as we do with so many other things. If somebody was to light up a cigarette in here without you in the room, somebody would just simply come over and just say, please put that out. If they chose not to put it out, then your staff would be called and an officer would come over here and give a warning. And if they chose not to adhere to the warning, that's the time when you would issue the infraction. Quite honestly, the number of times that somebody is going to go and ignore a person, another citizen saying, please don't smoke in the park, is going to be pretty rare. And in those rare cases, it's going to be even rarer for them to go and ignore a police warning. And if they do ignore both of those, I think an infraction is an appropriate tool to have in the toolkit of the municipal code to be able to help change the behavior of people. I understand your issue about sidewalks and streets, and just to be very clear, this draft ordinance does not have sidewalks or streets associated with it. They've been exempted out of it. But the number of sidewalks that are directly adjacent to a park or directly adjacent to a trail, those interactions are going to be very minimal as well. So I just want to at least provide that information. But I understand your concern, but I don't believe that, especially compared to some of the other things that we do, which is the same thing, if somebody litters we're not going to go and report it to the police. We're going to ask them, please don't go and throw your cup down on the ground. It just doesn't get to that point.
Okay, I'd like to take it back to the council and the committee to see if any other committee members or council members have questions or feedback. Councilmember Borneman on the committee.
Yeah, I understand the intent, and I haven't smoked in, what is it now, 26 years. But I was an active smoker. I understand how hard it is when you do smoke to not smoke. The addiction is strong. I understand the effects of secondhand smoke and things, and I don't think anyone should be doing it. But that said, I have problems with the ordinance in the sense that, one, I am one who realizes I think sometimes we have too many rules and regulations in general, especially ones that are hard to enforce. And then when they're there, they can be used for selective enforcements. We know with this one in particular that it's going to affect certain segments of the population much greater than others. It's going, because demographically, if you look at where smokers are these days, and lower income folks are much more likely in many ways to be smokers. And then higher incomes, higher education, homeless people around, you wonder, well, how can they afford to smoke? They shouldn't be smoking anyway, God damn it. But the fact is, they do. And to have something so broad as to greenway all the trail systems that you can't smoke, and I have a problem with the vapor thing because I don't think the secondhand part of that is going to, in the outdoors, has much of a bearing. I could support limited parts of this. I have no problem saying there's no smoking in parks within a certain distance from any of the playground equipment and those kinds of things. That I have no problem with, but just a general blanket on all trails, everything, and it's something that we can't enforce, I have problems with that. So that's my comment right now.
Councilmember Lillquist?
Thank you. I don't think that this generally endangering and littering activity needs any special protections by us, and I think that we can appropriately put in higher standards of conduct in public spaces. I also think it's nice to make accommodations for people who do happen to be addicted to an unhealthy habit. So my question has to do with the appointed designated smoking areas. How many of these do we have, and where have we put them in the past? Because it seems to me we should be able to make accommodations away from playgrounds, for example, for people to do this sort of, otherwise, dangerous or harmful and littering activity.
Mayor Linville?
Just to follow up on that, and I think I was going to follow up on what Terry said, there is some information that shows exactly what each of these communities actually ban. So I think Jack was correct. They all enacted some kind of ordinance, and then there is a list of what was the limits on the ordinances, and we can send that information to you so you have it if you decide to consider this further, and that will give you some ideas. Now, I think Leslie maybe can be more specific about what we do in Bellingham.
Council members, any additional questions or feedback? Okay, I'm seeing none. Is there a motion, or shall we just carry this on for future conversations? Councilmember Weiss.
Well, I'd like to move the ordinance as a recommendation of the full council for this evening.
We have a motion to approve a proposed ordinance for a smoking ban in city parks. Any further discussion? All those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Those opposed say nay.
Nay.
This will come forward with a mixed recommendation and further discussion at tonight's council meeting. End of committee.